Hi everyone and welcome back to another interesting video. In this lecture we are going to be looking into the impacts of presidential elections 1965 और जैसे कि आप सबको पता है कि उस टाइम अयूब खान का regime था and presidential elections for the first time were held in the country and they were introduced for the first time in the political history of Pakistan. So, a thorough study of history reveals that past events leaves a far-reaching effect on the history of an area or a country or a region. And even the same is true about the presidential elections of 1965 जिसके बहुत ज़्यादा effects हुए थे and basically it left a great imprints over the history of Pakistan in many ways. So here are some of the political, social and historical impacts of presidential elections that are worth mentioning, and we'll be studying those impacts. So let's get started. So, political impacts of the 1965 presidential elections on the history of Pakistan. So, the presidential elections of 1965 जो थे वो that were contested between Miss Fatma Jinnah and against the ruling president of the state, and she set an example of the extraordinary courage to challenge the most powerful ruler of her time, क्योंकि उसका जो decision था ना to contest the presidential elections, उसके जो result थे, it affected the politics of Pakistan in many ways. Like we can see that the decision of Miss Fatma Jinnah to contest presidential elections of 1965, it basically encouraged the Pakistani women to participate in political activity and more actively to get their important place in the politics of the country. And women prominent place in the politics of Pakistan is considered as a precious heritage of Miss Fatma Jinnah. क्योंकि because the leadership during the presidential elections paved way for the political empowerment of the women of the nation of Pakistan. So the candidature of Ms. Fatma Jinnah in her presidential elections, it also caused a solution to the permanent and a very sensitive issue regarding the female headship of an Islamic state. क्योंकि उस टाइम ये माना जाता था और उस टाइम इस्लामिक एक्सट्रीमिस्ट लोग जो थे दे वर ऑफ द व्यू कि मतलब एक औरत जो है वो हुक्मरानी नहीं कर सकती, एक औरत जो है वो प्राइम मिनिस्टर या प्रेसिडेंट नहीं बन सकती, एंड शी कैन नॉट इवन होल्ड द हाईएस्ट पॉलिटिकल ऑफिस. तो ये उस टाइम माना जाता था, बट इट इज़ कंसिडर्ड एज मिस फातिमा's legacy which made it possible for the women of Pakistan to hold high ये क्या है political offices and even to be the head of the state. So the fatwa of Maulana Maududi in her favor of the candidature, like it forever resolved the issue that women can be and could be the head of the Islamic State. और फिर इसी की वजह से जो है ना मिस फातिमा जिन्ना की जो लेगेसी है उसने दैट बेसिकली इनेबल्ड बेनज़ीर भुट्टो टू होल्ड द हाईएस्ट पॉलिटिकल ऑफिस एज अ चेयरपर्सन. फिर बेनज़ीर भुट्टो बाद में बहुत प्रोमिनेंट पॉलिटिकल पार्टी जो थी पाकिस्तान पीपल्स पार्टी, उनकी चेयरपर्सन भी बनी और शी इवन बिकेम द प्राइम मिनिस्टर ऑफ द कंट्री इन 1988 एंड इवन फॉर द सेकेंड टाइम इन 1993. And even the two women in Bangladesh, they also served as prime ministers of the country after its emergence as an independent state in 1971. So, Miss Fatma Jinnah's struggle for democracy and her challenge to General Ayub Khan, it provided a base for Benazir Bhutto to launch a movement for revival of the democracy in the country by challenging the ruler of her time. और Benazir Bhutto के time पे उस time General Ziaul Haq थे, he was the powerful ruler, the dictator. So she followed the footprints of Miss Fatma Jinnah, and that has always remained a great source of inspiration for the Muslim women of the South Asia. और इसी की वजह से फिर बेनज़ीर भुट्टो जो है वो जनरल ज़ियाउल हक के साथ इलेक्शंस में लड़ी थी. So these were the political impacts of the presidential elections of 1965, and now we are going to move to the social impacts of presidential elections 1965 over the history of Pakistan. So the social impacts. So presidential elections of 1965 and its after effect, it basically caused a great change in the social philosophy and Pakistani society जो है ना उसकी, and affected the social system in a positive way, क्योंकि उस time there like it can be seen a great change in public thinking and social attitudes after the election क्योंकि the courageous step of Miss Fatma Jana it gave confidence to the suppressed people to raise their voice for their rights and even as well for the revival of the democracy. So it was a great change that people openly protested against a dictator which could not be imagined before, that to take stand against General Ayub Khan, and then he later on ultimately had to surrender before the nationwide protest. फिर उन्होंने बाद में सरेंडर भी किया था इन 1965, मतलब ही बेसिकली स्टेप डाउन. तो पाकिस्तानी सोसाइटी जो है ना इट अंडरवेंट चेंज रिगार्डिंग द सोशल स्टेटस ऑफ वुमेन एंड इट बिकेम एक्सेप्टेबल टू द सोसाइटी that women can enjoy equal status with men in holding high political offices, and then afterwards the ratio of women participation in political activities increased. And we can also see that the decision of an aged and a delicate lady to fight the battle for democracy against the ruler of the time, it proved that women were as strong as men to accept difficult challenges. The social aspect of the decision of Ms. Fatma Jinnah to contest the election was focused on the balanced social life with the required female role to strengthen the social system of Pakistan, and even the contribution of women in political matters was based on the concept to develop a so strong and balanced society. So the election and its after effects changed the social philosophy and structure of the social system. The future governments then took necessary steps for empowerment of women. In considering the change of and norms of the society, per golden period आया था regarding the empowerment of women during the Musharraf era, and then he established the permanent national commission regarding the status of women in Pakistan. So, if we see, so presidential elections of 1965 were a duel between democratic and autocratic forces. Apparently, if we see that, so we can conclude that autocratic forces won because of having a hold on all the resources and powers, but ultimately they had to face the defeat in 1969. Here, democratic forces became stronger with the passage of time, and then they forced the military rulers to resort to restore the real democracy in the country. So, the first general elections in the country were then held in 1970, which resulted in the democratic trends of the society, and even the subsequent drafted constitution of 1973 was the real reflection of democratic philosophy of the society and social trends of the time in Pakistan. And the analysis of presidential elections was carried out on the directions of Ayub Khan by his information secretary, which even later on revealed that the democracy was the major source of the popularity of Miss Fatma Jinnah, and that was also a main factor of her support. That was the main factor, like behind her support by the intellectuals. So these were the social impacts of presidential elections of 1965. The presidential elections of 1965 have its historical impacts which affected the history of Pakistan seriously, and then it resulted in the follow-up events also, like Ayub Khan after announcement of the results of the elections, he promised in his victory speech that he will not launch any act of hostility and revenge against his rivals, but unfortunately things went on the opposite direction because Ayub Khan's son Gohar Ayub violated section 144, and then in 1965 January 4, by firing in the air to express the joy of for the victory of his father in the presidential elections of 1965, that led, and he also led a very huge processions of heavy vehicles on the roadways of the Karachi. He demonstrated his power and authority to threaten the COP. matlab COP was the combined opposition parties, the leaders of COP, and these activities were totally ignored by the government of that time. So on the same day at night, Pakistan Army supporters of Ayub Khan, they went to those areas of Karachi which strongly opposed him, and then they got in the revengeful activities there. Even houses were set on fire and people were fired upon at Liaquat Abad, and the people came forward to defend themselves, and that two-way battle continued all the night. The wounded were then shifted to the hospitals, but army had to take control of that area. But the apparent devastation and loss in that area reflected the hatred and enmity between the two groups. According to the first official statements, 6 people were killed in the riots, but later on 20 casualties were admitted. It was believed that by the public that the number of casualties and estimated loss of property was over the above than the official figures stated. The after effects of the incident badly affected the history of Pakistan. It was the beginning of an unending and deep rooted clashes between the people, and it destroyed the peace of Karachi for a long time, and even it remained a headache for every government who came in power after the elections of 1965. So, these were the historical impacts of the presidential elections of 1965. The presidential system of government was adopted for the first time in the country under the second constitution of Pakistan, which was enforced in the country in 1962. The main factor behind the presidential form of government was the aspiration of Ayub Khan, who wanted to hold all the powers and authority in his own hands, like even after the abolition of martial law. Therefore, the presidential elections were announced and contested in 1965. So, these elections occupy an important and unique place in the elections in the history of the country. After a thorough study of the presidential elections, it is concluded that politics was involved from the very beginning, as revealed by the introduction of the indirect elections through the Electoral College of the Basic Democrats जो बीडीज थे, जो अयूब खान ने इंट्रोड्यूस कराए थे बीडी सिस्टम, और वो 80,000 बेसिक डेमोक्रेट्स थे जिन्होंने सिर्फ इनडायरेक्ट मेथड के थ्रू अयूब खान को इलेक्ट करना था. तो इवन इफ वी सी देयर वाज अ फ्लॉ इन द 1962 कॉन्स्टिट्यूशन दैट इट curtailed द ये एडल्ट ये फ्रेंचाइज जो है, ठीक है, मतलब पीपल वर नॉट गिवन द राइट टू वोट. तो इनडायरेक्ट सिस्टम ऑफ वो थी इलेक्शंस. फिर we can also see that politics was involved through electoral rolls and polling process in order to make it possible for Ayub Khan to win the elections. The state machinery was manipulated for influencing voters and elections result. So, like all sorts of rigging and malpractices were employed to outcast Miss Fatma Jinnah, and promises of incentives to bureaucrats and businessmen were also made for providing support during the elections. तो ये सारी बातें थी that Ayub Khan and his party employed to make him win the election in all possible ways. So even at some point, religious card was also used for weakening the position of Miss Fatma Jinnah, who was popular among the public क्योंकि सब उन मतलब शी वॉज नोन एज द सिस्टर ऑफ कायद आज़म. सो मतलब ये भी एक वो पॉइंट था, फ्लॉ था. सो बैड पॉलिटिकल कल्चर वी कैन से. So the impacts of presidential elections were deep rooted, and they also affected the history of Pakistan in many ways. Like Miss Fatma Jinnah in the presidential elections, she emerged as a symbol of federation and democracy in the country that permanently solved the sensitive issue of female headship of the Muslim state. It also proved to be a milestone for the empowerment of women in Pakistan, and then later on, following her footprints, Benazir Bhutto confronted a dictator and succeeded against him. So I've told this before. The presidential elections caused a powerful movement in against the Ayub Khan for the revival of parliamentary democracy, and in Pakistan, which at last succeeded to achieve its objectives. So, the presidential elections of 1965 also promoted a bad political culture in the country because, succeeding rulers also have tried to manipulate and influence the elections and have hindered the way of a strong and healthy democratic process. So, this was and even later on parliamentary form of government was in strengthened, and it was believed that even Pakistan के लिए जो best form of government है that's parliamentary democracy, क्योंकि it cannot survive with the presidential form of government क्योंकि उसके अंदर centralized powers होती हैं, provincial autonomy नहीं होती as such, इतनी और भी flaws हैं, तो पाकिस्तान के लिए it's not suitable. So this was all. Thank you so much for watching, and this marks the end of this lecture. I hope you liked the video. If you did, please give this video a thumbs up and subscribe to my channel. I'll be coming up with more videos of political science and international relations.